For 32 years, my younger brother drove 90 miles on the second Tuesday of every month to a town he told me he could not stand. He said he was going to help an old army friend who had fallen off a roof and never walked right again. He said the man's name was Frank Doyle. He described Frank's dog, Frank's bad hip, the way Frank took his coffee. He described that man so often and so well that I could have picked him out of a crowd. Frank Doyle did not exist. There was no army friend in that town. There was something else waiting there, in a steel drawer in the back of an old bank, filed under a name I had never once heard my brother say out loud. And when I finally lifted the lid on that drawer, 6 days after we put him in the ground, what I found did not simply break my heart. It reached back through 30 years of my life and rearranged every single thing I thought I knew about the quietest man I ever loved. Before I tell you how a man with a bad knee and a paid-off truck brought a family of vultures to their knees without ever raising his voice, do me one small favor. Subscribe to my channel, and tell me down in the comments if you have ever buried someone and realized, standing over the dirt, that you never really knew them at all. My name is Walter Ashford. I am 71 years old. I spent 43 years as a freight dispatcher for the Piedmont Rail Company outside Asheville, North Carolina, sitting in a room that smelled like burnt coffee and carbon paper, moving other men's cargo across other men's maps. I raised 2 children with my wife Marion, who died 12 years ago of ovarian cancer in a hospital room the color of dishwater. My son lives in Portland now. My daughter lives in Denver. They call on birthdays and sometimes not even then. My brother Elias Cobb was the only family I had left in this world. I should explain the different last names. Our mother married twice. Elias came from the second marriage, 8 years behind me, and our father raised us both without ever once making a distinction between the blood and the paperwork. To me, he was never a half anything. He was my brother. He was the boy who followed me down to the creek with his shoelaces untied, and he was the man who called me every Sunday evening for 40 years without missing more than a handful. The day they buried him was the hottest afternoon I can remember, the kind of heat that soaks your shirt through before you have made it down your own porch steps. The cemetery sat on a low rise outside Hendersonville, and the grass had gone the color of paper bags from a summer that forgot to rain. I stood there in my one black suit, the same suit I had worn for Marion, and I watched my niece and my nephew check their telephones while the pastor read from Corinthians. My niece is named Corinne. She is 44, sharp as a tax audit, and she works for a regional accounting firm in Charleston. My nephew is named Desmond. He is 41, a commercial real estate broker, and 11 years ago he married a woman named Priscilla, whom I have never once seen smile without something moving behind her eyes first, the way you see a cash register total up before the drawer opens. They were the only blood Elias had besides me. He never married. He never had children of his own, or so every one of us believed. He drove long-haul freight for a paper products company for 30 years, took early retirement at 58, and lived alone in a little brick ranch house on the edge of town with a bird feeder he filled every Sunday morning before he called me. I waited at the graveside after the prayer was done. I waited for Corinne to come over and put her arms around my neck the way she used to when she was 9, and I was the uncle who let her ride the tractor. I waited for Desmond to lay a hand on my shoulder and say something, anything, about his Uncle Walter being the last man standing. I waited the way you wait when you are old, and you have been decent your whole life, and you have earned the right to expect a small return on that investment. Instead, Priscilla walked over. Priscilla, not my own niece, not my nephew, the woman who married into us 11 years ago and has never, to my knowledge, learned what my father's first name was. She did not tell me she was sorry for my loss. She looked past my shoulder toward the parking lot, checked something on her wrist, and said, "Uncle Walter, we should talk about the cabin before everyone scatters." Uncle Walter. She said it the way a customer service representative says your name off a screen. The cabin she was talking about belonged to my brother. 2 bedrooms and a screened porch on Blue Ridge Lake, built by our father with his own hands in 1962. Out of lumber he hauled up there in a borrowed truck. Elias inherited it because I already had a house in Asheville, and our father wanted each of us to have something with his fingerprints on it. For 30-odd years, Elias had handed me the key any weekend I asked. He never once asked for gas money. He never once called it his. I told Priscilla that this was not the time. I told her my brother was not yet covered with dirt, and that whatever needed discussing could be discussed at the reception, or next week, or next month. She gave me a small, tight smile, the kind I imagine she has practiced in a mirror. "Walter," she said, and she dropped the uncle that fast. "With respect, I don't think you understand the situation. Elias didn't leave a will. When there's no will, the estate passes to next of kin. That's Desmond and Corinne. The cabin is already being appraised. We just wanted to extend you the courtesy of knowing." Courtesy. That was the word she chose. The courtesy of knowing that the porch, where far my father taught me to tie a blood knot, was being measured for sale before the straps were out from under the casket. I looked over at Desmond. He was studying his loafers, which had cost more than my first car. I looked for Corinne. She was already halfway to her rental, keys in her hand, the conversation over and filed as far as she was concerned. That is when I felt something move in my chest. Not a heart attack. Something colder and quieter than that. Something like a door swinging shut on a room I would never be invited into again. I did not go to the reception. I could not stomach the picture of the three of them eating little sandwiches off paper plates above my brother's body. I drove home alone with the windows down, because the air conditioning in my truck gave out in 2019, and I never saw the point in fixing it. I poured a bourbon at the kitchen table. I sat there with the ceiling fan ticking overhead, and I tried to remember the last real conversation I ever had with Elias. And while I sat there, something older surfaced. Something I had spent 40 years not looking at directly. In the spring of 1979, Elias came to my house. He was 24. He had a folder under his arm and a look on his face I had never seen before, a kind of hopeful terror. He sat at my kitchen table, the same table, and he told me he wanted to quit driving. He wanted to go back to school. He had it all written out, the tuition, the timeline, the part-time work he would take. He wanted to study finance, of all things. He wanted, he said, to learn how money actually worked, because he had spent his whole life watching men who understood it walk right past men who didn't. And I laughed at him. I want you to understand that I did not laugh cruelly. I laughed the way an older brother laughs. I laughed because I was 29 and I had a mortgage and a baby, and I thought I knew what the world was. I said something like, "Elias, you're a driver. Drivers drive. Don't go spending your good years chasing something you're not built for." He did not argue. He never argued. He closed the folder. He drank his coffee and asked about Marion and the baby, and he left before dark, and we never spoke about it again for the rest of his life. Not once in 46 years. I have thought about that afternoon maybe 4 times in my life before that August night. I thought about it 100 times in the weeks that followed. The last real conversation was 3 weeks before he died. A Sunday evening, the way it always was. We talked 40 minutes about nothing at all. The ball club was having a miserable season. His knee was talking to him again. He had seen a red-tailed hawk that morning, out past the feeder, and he described it to me in more detail than the hawk probably deserved. Then at the very end, in the pause before goodbye, he said something strange. He said, "Walt, if anything ever happens to me, the box is at Cornerstone Trust. Town called Millbrook Falls. You'll know the name when you see it." Then he laughed and said he was being morbid, and asked me whether I still had that busted gutter on the north side of the house. I had not thought about that sentence once until I was sitting at my kitchen table, with a bourbon going warm in my hand. You'll know the name when you see it. Millbrook Falls. I had never set foot in the place, but I knew exactly where it sat on a map, because my brother had driven 90 miles to it on the second Tuesday of every month for 32 years to help a man named Frank Doyle, who, as far as I could determine that night with a phone book and a stubborn refusal to trust the internet, had never lived in that town, that county, or that area code at all. Elias Cobb, the most honest man I ever knew, had been lying to me for a third of a century, and he had been very, very good at it. I did not sleep. The next morning I called Cornerstone Trust and asked the woman who answered whether my brother Elias Cobb kept a safe deposit box at their branch. She put me on hold for close to 4 minutes. When she came back, her voice had changed. It had gone careful, the way a voice goes careful when it is carrying something. She asked if I could come into the branch in person. Then she asked if I could be there before noon. I told her I was 3 hours away. She said, "I'll wait." Millbrook Falls turned out to be 1 block of Main Street wrapped around a traffic circle, with a Confederate monument in it that somebody had planted marigolds around, as if flowers could take the edge off history. There was a coffee shop called the Copper Kettle with a hand-painted sign, the kind you only see in towns that have not yet worked out that they could charge tourists double. There was a hardware store, a church, a barber pole that still turned. Cornerstone Trust occupied a brick building that had clearly been something else first. The teller windows were old. The floor was old. The air smelled like paper and pencil shavings, and the specific cold of a building that has been running the same air conditioner since Carter was president. The woman behind the counter looked up when I came through the door, and I knew before she opened her mouth that she had been watching that door all morning for me. Her name tag said Margaret, 65 or thereabouts, reading glasses on a beaded chain, and the steady, unhurried eyes of a woman who has watched people at their worst and their best across the same counter for 40 years and has stopped being surprised by either. She asked for identification. I handed over my license. She looked at it, then she looked at me, and I watched something move behind her face. Recognition, grief. I could not tell which, and I am not sure there is much difference, she said. You have his forehead. Then she came around the counter and told me to follow her. We went past the windows, past a row of small offices, back to a door with a keypad. She punched a code and we stepped into a room with a long oak table and a wall of steel drawers that had not been updated since Eisenhower. She asked me to wait. Then she went and got a man. He was tall and stooped, white hair combed with water, wearing a navy suit that hung on him the way a good suit hangs on a man who has recently lost weight from worrying. He came in slowly. He looked at me for what felt like a long time before he said anything at all. Then he said, Mr. Ashford, your brother was the closest friend I had in this world. I am very sorry for your loss. I had to sit down. His name was Nathaniel Reeve. He had managed that branch for 31 years. He had never laid eyes on me before that morning. And he knew everything about me. He knew I had worked the freight desk. He knew Marion had died of ovarian cancer, and that it had taken 14 months, and that I had slept in a chair for the last 11 days of it. He knew my son was in Portland, and my daughter was in Denver, and that neither one called the way a man hopes his children will call. He knew because my brother had been sitting in the chair I was sitting in 12 times a year for 32 years. And they had not spent all that time talking about interest rates. Nathaniel took out a key, a small brass thing, worn smooth on the edges from 3 decades of a thumb. He matched it to drawer 218. He turned his key and my brother's key together and drew out a long steel container and set it on the oak table like it was something that could bruise. Then he stepped back, folded his hands and said, "Take all the time you need, Walter. I'll be right outside that door." He closed it behind him. I sat alone with that box for a full minute before my hands would work. Inside were manila envelopes, stacked, each one labeled in my brother's blocky capital handwriting, the same handwriting that had been on every birthday card I got since 1963. The top one said, "For Walt first." I opened it. 3 pages of yellow legal paper, handwritten, dated a little over 2 years before he died. It began, "Walt, if you're reading this, I'm gone, and I'm sorry I never told you any of it while I was here. I didn't have the words. I had 30 years to find them, and I never did find them. So I'm going to try now, on paper, where I can start over when I get it wrong." And then my brother told me about his life. There had never been a Frank Doyle. He had made the man up on a Tuesday afternoon in 1993, in the parking lot of a filling station, he wrote, because he needed a story, and that was the first name that came into his head off a sign for Doyle's auto body across the road. He said he had felt sick about it for a week, and then he had never felt sick about it again. And that was the part that scared him most about himself. The truth started in 1991. He was 36 years old, running a tanker route through East Tennessee, and he stopped for supper at a roadside diner outside of Winston. There was a waitress there named Adeline Marsh. She was 28, divorced, with a 4-year-old daughter she called Wren, because the girl had come out weighing 5 pounds and making more noise than seemed possible. Adeline was the kind of woman, my brother wrote, who could make a man believe in God just by the way she poured coffee. He asked her to supper that night. She said no. He came back 2 weeks later on the same route and asked again. She said no again. He came back a 3rd time and did not ask at all, just sat in her section and read a paperback and left a tip that was more than the meal. And on the 4th visit, she sat down across from him on her break and told him, without preamble, exactly what her first husband had done to her. I am not going to put all of it in this story. Some of it is not mine to hand around. I will tell you that she had been in the hospital twice. I will tell you that the second time, a doctor in the emergency room had written down in her chart that she had fallen, because that is what she told him to write, because she had a 2-year-old at home and nowhere on this earth to take her. And I will tell you what she told my brother that night, because that is the part that explains the next 18 years. She told him she could love him. She said it plain on the 4th visit, like a woman reading terms off a contract. But she said she could only love him if she kept her own door, her own bed, her own key, her own life. She could not live inside another man's house again, not even a good man's, because she had learned in the worst way there is that a house with a man's name on the deed is a house you can be trapped in. Most men, I think, would have heard that as a rejection, would have taken it personally, the way men do, and driven off and told themselves she was damaged. My brother heard it as an instruction, so he built his life around it. In 1993, he bought a small house 2 streets over from hers in Millbrook Falls. Not with her, near her. He drove down on the 2nd Tuesday of every month and every other Sunday and most holidays, and he sat on her porch, and he read his paperbacks while Wren did her long division at the kitchen table. 18 years. He went to Wren's high school graduation and sat in the 4th row and clapped so hard that Adeline, he wrote, had to put a hand on his arm. He paid for her college. He paid for her nursing school. He walked her down the aisle in 2013 when she married a decent, unremarkable, deeply kind man named Graham Calloway. And he paid for that too, and when the photographer asked who he was, he said, "I'm a friend of the family," and stepped out of the picture. He never married Adeline. He wanted to. He wrote that sentence 4 times on those 3 pages, in 4 different ways, like a man circling a hole in the floor. She died in 2009 of an aneurysm at 46 years old, on a Tuesday, in the middle of her shift, with a coffee pot in her hand. He was 90 miles away with a load of newsprint on his back, and he did not find out for 6 hours. And then he wrote the part I have read maybe 200 times since. He wrote, "Walt, you're going to want to know why I never told you. You're going to sit there with this letter and think I didn't trust you. And that's going to hurt you, and I'd rather cut my own hand off. So here it is. In 1979, I came to your kitchen and told you I wanted to go back to school. You laughed. You didn't mean anything by it. I know you didn't, but I sat in my truck outside your house for 20 minutes afterward, and I decided something in that truck. And the thing I decided was that I was never going to hand you anything of mine to hold again. Not because you'd drop it, because I couldn't stand to watch your face while you decided whether to. That was a boy's decision. I was 24, and I made it. And then I was 54, and then I was 64, and it had turned into the shape of my whole life. And I never went back and undid it because by then undoing, it would have meant explaining 30 years. And how does a man do that on a Sunday phone call about a hawk? You didn't take anything from me, Walt. I gave it away. I want that in writing, in my hand, so you can't argue with me about it after I'm gone. I put the letter down on that oak table, and I put my head in my hands. And for the first time in my adult life, I understood that a man can be loved absolutely and permanently by someone he has, without ever once meaning to, taught to be afraid of him. The second envelope was thicker. It said, "Adeline, what you should know." Most of it was photographs. Adeline at 30, squinting into a sun that had washed the color out of everything. Adeline and Wren on a set of porch steps I would later come to know very well. Adeline asleep in a lawn chair, with a paperback on her chest and my brother's jacket over her legs, taken by somebody who loved her, which tells you who was holding the camera. Underneath the photographs was a court document. In 1996, Adeline's first husband found her. He had gotten out of a facility in Tennessee, and he had driven 4 hours, and he had parked across the street from her house on a Thursday afternoon in September and sat there. Wren was 9. Wren saw him from the window and did not know who he was, and told her mother a man was sitting outside, and her mother looked out through the curtain and did not speak for a full minute. My brother was in Ohio with a load. Here is what he did not do. He did not drive back and put his hands on that man. I want you to understand that Elias Cobb was 6'2", and had loaded freight by hand for 15 years, and could have folded that man like a road map. Every fiber of what I know about being a man in this part of the country says that is what he should have done. And I believe there is a version of this story where he does it, and where he goes to prison for it. and where Ren grows up with nobody. What he did instead was call Nathaniel Reeve at a bank at 9 o'clock at night and ask him for the name of a lawyer. Then he paid that lawyer. He paid for the protective order. He paid for the filing and the service, and the hearing and the second hearing when the man violated it, and he paid for a locksmith to change every lock on Adeline's house. And he paid for a security light over her back door, and he paid a retired deputy who lived on that street $400 a month for 2 years to keep an eye out on Thursday. And Adeline never knew who paid for any of it. He told her the county had a fund for it. There is no such fund. The man went back to prison in 1998 on an unrelated charge and died there in 2004. Elias found out and wrote one line in the margin of the court document, and it is the only unkind thing I ever saw in my brother's handwriting. It said, "Good." I had to walk around that room for a while. When I came back to the table, I picked up the third envelope. It was labeled, "The Numbers." Inside was a bound statement, professionally printed, with a notarized cover page, 41 years of it. I flipped past the pages I could not follow to the summary at the back, and I found the total at the bottom. And I read it 3 times because I was certain my eyes had put a comma somewhere it did not belong. After taxes, after every expense, after the house in Millbrook Falls, after Wren's college and nursing school and wedding, after 18 years of protecting a woman who never knew she was being protected, after the cabin's roof and the cabin's dock and 40 years of birdseed bought every Sunday morning of his life. $41,620,000 and change. I want to be careful here, because I have watched enough of these stories to know that the number is the part people remember. And the number is the least interesting thing in this entire account. My brother was not lucky. My brother did not win anything. In 1983, our father died and left each of us $40,000. I put mine down on the house in Asheville, which was the correct and responsible thing to do. And I have never once regretted it, and it is the reason I have a roof over me tonight. Elias took his $40,000 and walked it into a bank in a town he had no reason to be in, and handed it to a 26-year-old financial advisor named Nathaniel Reeve, who had been in the job 11 months and had exactly 4 clients, and said, "Do something smart with this." And Nathaniel Reeve did something smart with it. Then he did something smart with it again and again. Every second Tuesday of the month, for 4 decades, while my brother sat across the desk from him with a thermos of coffee and asked questions and listened to the answers and learned, slowly, the thing he had wanted to learn in 1979 in my kitchen. He never did go back to school. He went to Nathaniel Reeve instead, 12 times a year for 32 years, and got an education one Tuesday at a time from a man who was learning it right alongside him. Nathaniel told me later, in his office, that in 2001 he had made a recommendation that cost my brother a great deal of money. A serious mistake. He said he wrote a letter of resignation from my brother's account and brought it to the next Tuesday meeting in an envelope. He said my brother did not open the envelope. He said my brother pushed it back across the desk and said, "Nate, I've been driving 26 years, and I've put a truck in a ditch twice. You want me to fire myself?" Nathaniel Reeve is 74 years old, he cried in front of me telling that story, and did not bother apologizing for it, which I respected more than anything he could have said. The last thing in that third envelope was a single sheet of paper, and it was the one that took my legs out from under me. It was a wire transfer record, 2004, $231,000, paid out over 4 years to a university in Oregon. My son's university. My son had a scholarship, that is what we were told. That is what the letter said on the letterhead with the seal. Marion cried at the kitchen table when that letter came. She called her sister. She kept that letter in the drawer with the good silverware until the day she died, and I found it in there, and I could not throw it away, and it is still in that drawer tonight. There was no scholarship. There was a man in a truck who called a banker in Millbrook Falls and asked him how you give money to somebody without their father finding out, because their father is a proud man and would not take it, and it would have humiliated him, and he has already been humiliated enough by a life that never gave him one single break. Nathaniel had written a note on the bottom of that page, dated the week after Elias died, in a different ink than everything else in the box. It said, "He made me promise not to tell you until he was gone. I have kept every promise I made that man. This is the last one, and I am glad to be rid of it. N.R. My wife died believing our son had earned that scholarship. My son believes it tonight. He is 50 years old, and he has a good job and a paid-off house and a certain confidence in himself that I always assumed I had given him. And every bit of it was built on a foundation poured in secret by a man who was laughed out of my kitchen in 1979 for wanting to understand how money worked. I did not cry at my brother's funeral. I want to be honest about that. I stood there in the heat in my dead wife's suit, and I was too angry at my niece and my nephew to feel anything about the man in the box. I cried in that bank. Not the polite kind. The kind that comes up from underneath your ribs and takes your breath and makes a sound you do not recognize as your own. I cried until Margaret opened the door and looked at me, and closed it again without a word, which was exactly the right thing to do, and I will be grateful to that woman for the rest of my life. I cried because he had lived an entire enormous life I was never allowed to see, because he had loved a woman I never met, and raised a girl who was not his blood, and who was, in every way that has ever mattered on this earth, his daughter, because he had carried all of it alone for 32 years, and the only person on the planet who knew the whole shape of it was a banker in a little Confederate monument town, who saw him 12 times a year. And because he did all of it, every last dollar and every last mile, in a silence that I built. When I could breathe, I opened the fourth envelope. It was thin. It held one thing, a green cloth-bound ledger, the kind bookkeepers used before screens, with a black spine gone soft at the corners from being opened. The label on the envelope said, "The Other Lawns." The first entry was dated 2006. Corinne asked Marion for $2,000 for the security deposit on her first apartment. Marion gave it to her. Corinne used it as a down payment on a leased car. I found out because her landlord called the cabin number by mistake, having gotten it off an old form. I made the deposit good myself. Marion never knew. Walt never knew. I turned the page. I kept turning pages for an hour and 40 minutes. My niece had been borrowing money from my wife for 5 years. 2,000, 1,200. 4,000 for a certification course. 800, and 800, and 800 again. Always with a promise. Always with the same request attached. Don't tell Uncle Walter, he'll worry. He's got enough on his plate. Between 2006 and 2011, Marion gave my niece $31,000 that we did not have. In 2009, Marion sold her mother's ring. I remember the day she told me it had slipped off her finger in the garden, and I remember spending an entire Saturday on my hands and knees in the dirt, with a metal detector I borrowed from a neighbor. And I remember her standing on the porch watching me look for it. Corinne never repaid a cent. Elias repaid all of it, in cash. In installments over 4 years, handed to Marion in envelopes with a story attached each time about how Corinne had finally come good on it, how the girl was turning a corner, how she'd asked him to pass it along because she was ashamed to bring it herself. My wife died in 2013, believing her niece had made things right. I sat in that room and I thought about the specific look on Marion's face when she told me about that, the relief in it, and I understood that my brother had spent 4 years of his life and $31,000 of his own money buying my dying wife, a lie that let her keep loving somebody. And that he never once told me, because telling me would have meant taking that lie away from her. I want to be fair to Corinne, and it is going to cost me something to be fair to her, so bear with me. Elias wrote a note in the margin of the 2006 page. It said, "She's not a bad kid, she's a scared one. She got divorced at 25 and lost her job in the same March, and she has never once in her life had anybody tell her that money is a thing you learn instead of a thing you are." That was true. That was all true. Corinne had a rough patch, and it was a real rough patch, and nobody in this family, myself included, put an arm around that girl when it happened. We let her white-knuckle it alone, and we told ourselves she was tough. But there is a page in that ledger from 2011 that ends the fairness. By 2011, Corinne was making $140,000 a year. She was not scared anymore. She was not struggling. And in October of 2011, she called my wife, who at that point had known about the cancer for 9 weeks and had not told anybody outside the house yet. And she asked her for $2,000 for a car repair, and my wife wired it to her the next morning. A thing does not stay a wound forever. At some point, a thing you keep doing becomes a thing you are. The next section was Desmond. In 2014, my nephew was investigated for fraud involving inflated commercial appraisals on 4 properties in Colombia. He was not charged. A witness, a junior associate at his firm named in the file, recanted 48 hours before the grand jury convened, and moved to Florida the following month, and the case fell apart. Elias paid that witness $85,000. He wrote about it at length, and it is the only place in that entire ledger where my brother sounds like a man trying to convince himself. He wrote, "I am not proud of this entry. I want that on the record. What I did here was buy a man's testimony, and there is a name for that, and the name is not a nice one. I did not do it for Desmond. Desmond earned every day of what was coming to him. I did it because Walt has buried a wife, and if he had to sit in a courtroom and watch that boy get let out in cuffs, it would have finished him. And I am not willing to trade my brother's last good years for my own clean conscience. I know what that makes me. I did it anyway. If there's a bill for it, send it to me and not to him." And underneath, in different ink added later, "Note for later. Desmond didn't come up with that scheme. He got handed it by a senior partner and he was too weak to say no. And he was in over his head on the house Priscilla wanted, and he took the coward's road. That's not the same as evil. It's not much better either. But if the boy ever gets a chance to be a man about something, I want it written down somewhere that I thought he had it in him. Not much of it, some. Then came Priscilla. The first entry on her was 2017, 2 years into the marriage. She had been having an affair with a partner at the law firm where she used to work. The partner's wife hired an investigator. The investigator had photographs, dates, hotel receipts, the whole miserable catalog. The wife had been preparing to send all of it to Desmond and, out of some instinct I cannot name, to Corinne, who was apparently a friend of hers from a charity board. Elias paid the investigator $40,000 to lose the file. He wrote, "Priscilla does not deserve protection. Let me be plain about that in my own book. I am not buying her redemption. I'm buying us quiet. Walt has one nephew left, and if that marriage detonates in public, the boy will not survive it, and the whole thing will end up on Walt's kitchen table, where it does not belong." And then, 4 pages later, an entry from 2018 that made my hands go cold. Ran into Priscilla's mother at the hospital in Charleston, of all the places on God's earth. She'd had a fall, didn't know who I was. I sat with her 2 hours because there was nobody else there. She talked the whole time. She told me her daughter had picked Desmond off a list. Her word, a list. She said Priscilla came home from a party in 2013 and said she'd found one. Commercial real estate, family money somewhere behind him. No spine on him at all. Her mother laughed telling me this. She was proud of it. She thought I was a chaplain. There were more. A hotel bill in Las Vegas in 2019 with damages and services on it that I will not itemize here out of respect for a child who is 9 years old and did not choose his parents. A tax matter of Corinne's, buried in a side account her firm did not know about, that would have cost her the certification she had spent 20 years earning. Elias paid all of it. By the last entry, dated 4 months before he died, my brother had quietly paid out $611,000 cleaning up after my niece, my nephew, and my nephew's wife. $611,000 so that I could keep believing that I came from decent people. And the terrible arithmetic of it, the part I sat with in that cold little room until my back ached, is this. He was right. It worked. For 19 years it worked perfectly. I loved them. I sent them Christmas cards. I told people at the freight desk about my niece the accountant and my nephew in real estate. He bought me 19 good years, and he paid for them out of his own pocket. And I never knew I was living on borrowed time, and borrowed money, and borrowed decency. And then they stood over his grave in the heat, before the dirt was settled, and asked about the appraisal. I closed the ledger, I closed the box. I sat there for a long while in a room full of steel drawers, and I thought about a man in a truck in 1979 deciding never to hand me anything again. Then I stood up, and I went to find Nathaniel Reeve, because I wanted to meet my brother's daughter. Nathaniel made a telephone call from his office, while I sat across from him, and drank a glass of water I did not want. An hour later, a woman in her late 30s came through the front door of that bank with a toddler on her hip, and a look on her face like she had been waiting her entire life for a door to open. She had her mother's eyes. Nathaniel told me that afterward. I would not have known. She did not say anything at first. She put the boy down. She looked at me for maybe 3 seconds, and then she put both arms around my neck and held on the way you hold on to something in high water. When she could talk, she said, "He talked about you every single day, Uncle Walter. Every day. He used to tell me his big brother was the smartest man he knew. I want to tell you what that sentence did to a 71-year-old man who had spent 46 years not thinking about a folder on a kitchen table. And I find that I cannot. Her name is Ren Marsh Calloway. She is a nurse. She works nights in a cardiac unit, and she has her mother's hands and my brother's way of going quiet and looking at you for a second before she answers a question, which is a thing you cannot inherit and can only catch, the way you catch an accent, from 30 years of sitting on a porch beside somebody. The boy on her hip was 6 months old that day. His name is Elias Walter Calloway. She had known about me my whole life. She had grown up with a photograph of me on a shelf in her mother's house. She thought I was a man who did not want to know her. She had thought that for 30 years, and she hugged me anyway. That is the part I still cannot get past. She thought I had chosen not to know her, and when I finally walked through the door, she did not make me explain a thing. I drove home that night with the green ledger on the passenger seat of my truck. I did not sleep. I sat up at the kitchen table until the light came gray over the back fence, and I made a list on a yellow legal pad. And by the time the sun cleared the maple, I knew what I was going to do. The next morning I called Nathaniel and asked for the name of my brother's lawyer. He said the name was Edmund Whitlock, that Whitlock had been Elias's estate attorney for 19 years, and that Edmund Whitlock had been sitting by a telephone for 6 days waiting for me to call him. Whitlock drove up to Asheville that afternoon with a briefcase. He put a document on my kitchen table, in the exact spot where my brother had put a folder in 1979. And it was a will, signed, witnessed, notarized in 2017, and amended as recently as the previous spring, filed with his office for 8 years. The will my niece and nephew had been told did not exist. Priscilla had not lied about that, incidentally. I want to be precise, because precision is the only weapon a decent man really has. She had not lied. She had assumed. She had assumed a truck driver who lived in a brick ranch with a bird feeder could not possibly have had an attorney. And she had built a plan on that assumption, and she had walked up to me over my brother's grave and told me the plan with her chin up. The will named me, Walter Ashford, as sole executor. It named Ren Marsh Calloway as the primary beneficiary of the bulk of the estate. There were specific bequests to Nathaniel Reeve, to Margaret at the teller counter, to a children's hospital in Winston where Adeline had died, and to me personally, in an amount I am not going to write down here, because it is more money than I will spend in whatever years are left to me, and because writing it down would make this story about the wrong thing. And there was a clause about Corinne and Desmond. The clause stated that any funds my brother had advanced or paid out on their behalf, as documented in the ledger, were to be treated as loans, recoverable upon his death, with interest at the prime rate from the date of each advance. The total came to $741,000. Whitlock explained it to me twice. Slowly, the way you explain something to a man you can see is not entirely in the room. He said the ledger alone would not carry it in court. He said what carried it was underneath. The canceled checks, the wire confirmations, the bank records, 19 years of them, cross-referenced and indexed and photocopied twice, sitting in a file in his office in Millbrook Falls since 2017. My brother had built the case. He had built it patiently, for years, the way he did everything, and then he had died without ever using it. I asked Whitlock why. If he had it all, why not do it himself? He had 19 years. Whitlock took a long time answering. He said, "Mr. Ashford, he told me once that he wasn't going to spend 1 hour of your life on it while he was alive. He said you'd only get so many Christmases with those kids, and he wasn't going to be the man who took them. He said if it needed doing, it could be done after he was gone, and it would cost you less then." I sat in my kitchen and I understood that my brother had left me a loaded weapon and a note that said only, "Your call." I did not sleep that night either. I want to tell this part honestly, because I think it is the only part of this whole account that might actually be worth something to somebody watching. Around 2 in the morning, I got a piece of the yellow legal paper out, the same pad, and I wrote a letter to my niece and my nephew. In that letter, I forgave the whole thing, all of it. The $31,000 from a dying woman, the ring in the garden, the witness in Colombia, the photographs, the appraisal talk in the heat over the open ground. I wrote that we were the last of us, and that I was 71, and that I did not want to spend whatever I have left on this side of it being a man who collects debts. I wrote that I loved them, which was true when I wrote it, and is, in a complicated way I am not proud of, still true tonight. I read it over twice, It was a good letter. It was, I think, the most Christian thing I have ever written. And then I sat there, and I thought about Marion, on her hands and knees on the porch, steps watching me look for a ring in the dirt with a borrowed metal detector. And I thought about my brother in a filling station parking lot in 1993, inventing a man named Frank Doyle, because I had taught him that his own life was not safe to hand me. And I thought about a 9-year-old girl looking out a window at a man parked across the street. I thought about how every single person in this story who ever did a quiet, decent thing did it at their own expense. And every single person who ever did a selfish thing did it at somebody else's. I tore the letter up. I want to be clear about what I am saying, because I have heard a lot of people confuse these two things, and I have confused them myself. I did not tear it up because I was bitter. I tore it up because forgiveness that costs the forgiver nothing, and the forgiven nothing is not forgiveness. It is just paperwork. It is a way of buying yourself out of a hard afternoon and calling it grace. Mercy, when it is real, is a thing you give a person who has stopped. None of them had stopped. 3 days later, Edmund Whitlock and I sat down, with my niece, my nephew, and Priscilla, in a conference room in downtown Asheville. I had asked them to come for what I called a family discussion about Elias's affairs. Every one of them cleared their schedule inside of 2 hours, which tells you something. Priscilla arrived in heels and a blouse that cost what I used to make in a month. And she took the chair at the far end of the table without being offered it. Corinne arrived with a leather folio under her arm, like a woman walking into a deposition she has already won. Desmond arrived last, and he arrived nervous. He has always been nervous. He was nervous at 9 years old when he lost a baseball glove I gave him, and could not make himself tell me for 2 days. Whitlock started. He explained that Elias had in fact left a will. Priscilla's eyes came up. He explained that the will had been on file for 8 years. Corinne sat up straighter and opened her folio. He explained that the estate was substantially larger than the family had been given to understand. Desmond said quietly, "How much larger?" Whitlock told him. There was a silence in that room that I am going to remember on my deathbed. 6 seconds, maybe 8. Priscilla's mouth came open. She looked at Desmond, and it was not a look of shock, it was a look of calculation resuming after a brief interruption. And I watched a woman spend $41 million in her head in the time it takes to draw a breath. Then Whitlock explained who the beneficiary was. He explained Wren. He explained Adeline. He explained the second Tuesday of every month for 32 years, and a house 2 streets over and a folder on a kitchen table in 1979. I watched my niece's face travel from greed to confusion to fury in about 8 seconds, and I want to tell you that it was the fastest work I have ever seen a human face do. She said, "This is fraud. That woman is not a Cobb. She is not an Ashford. She has no claim on $1 of this." Whitlock said, very politely, "That legal claim is determined by the will of the deceased, and that the will of the deceased was signed, witnessed, notarized, and had been sitting in a fireproof cabinet in Millbrook Falls since before her uncle bought his last truck." Priscilla said, "We'll contest." Whitlock said, "You're welcome to. There's a no contest clause. Any beneficiary who challenges forfeits their share." Corinne said, and she said it fast, "Because she is quick, she has always been quick. That is the tragedy of her. We're not beneficiaries. We have nothing to forfeit." And Edmund Whitlock, who is 72 years old and has been waiting 19 years for that exact sentence, opened his briefcase. He took out the green ledger and set it on the table. Corinne's eyes went to it the way a deer's eyes go to headlights. "I spoke for the first time since hello," I said. "That book has every dollar my brother paid out on behalf of the 3 of you for 19 years. Marion's money that you never paid back, Corinne, the $31,000. Your grandmother's ring that your aunt sold in 2009 and told me she lost in the garden, and that I spent a Saturday looking for in the dirt on my hands and knees while she stood on the porch and watched me. The witness in Columbia, Desmond. The investigator with the photographs, Priscilla. The hotel in Las Vegas. The tax account your firm doesn't know about, Corinne, the one in your maiden name. All of it, 19 years of it." Priscilla went the color of putty. Desmond started breathing in a way I did not like. Corinne put her hand flat on the table. I watched her do it. I watched her steady herself, and she said, "Uncle Walter, you can't prove." I said, "I don't need to prove anything. The ledger isn't the proof. The ledger's just the story. The proof is the canceled checks and the wire transfers and the bank records. 19 years of them, indexed in a file cabinet in a town, none of you have ever heard of, put together by a man you thought was too simple to have a lawyer. Whitlock slid a document across the table, a demand letter. The estate was calling in the advances as loans, with interest, totaling $741,000. 30 days to repay principal or enter a structured settlement. After 30 days, the estate would file, attach wages, freeze accounts, and pursue every remedy available under North Carolina law, of which Mr. Whitlock assured them there were a satisfying number. Priscilla said, "You cannot do this," I said. "It's already done. It was done in 2017. You just weren't in the room." Corinne tried once more. I will give her this. She is not a quitter. She raised the cabin. She said that regardless of anything else, the cabin should pass through intestate succession to the next of kin, and that she and her brother were prepared to be reasonable about a buyout. Whitlock informed her that the cabin had been deeded into a private trust in 2009, the year Adeline died, with Wren Marsh Calloway as the named beneficiary. The cabin had not legally been part of my brother's estate for 15 years. She had stood over an open grave in 100 degrees of heat and told me she was selling a thing that had never for 1 minute of her adult life belonged to her, and she had told me it as a courtesy. That was when Desmond started to cry. Not the pretty kind, the ugly kind. The kind that comes out of a 41-year-old man who has just been weighed in front of witnesses and found wanting by the last uncle he has. He said, "Uncle Walter, please. I've got a kid. I've got a mortgage. I cannot come up with that money." And I looked at my nephew for a long time. I thought about the boy who stayed with us 2 weeks every summer and cried when it was time to go home. I thought about the baseball glove. I thought about Marion, who loved that boy fiercely and without qualification. Handing him money she did not have because she believed in him, and believed belief was a thing you could give somebody like a loan. I thought about my brother in 2014, sitting in a bank in Millbrook Falls, writing a check for $85,000 to keep that boy out of a courtroom, and then writing in his own book, in his own hand, that he was not proud of it, and doing it anyway, and never telling a living soul. And I thought about the note underneath, not much of it. Some. I said, "Desmond, my brother gave you a life you did not earn. He gave it to you because he loved me, and he knew I loved you. And that is the only reason you have a license and a house, and a child who thinks you're an honest man. You stood at his grave and talked about appraisals before the straps were out from under him." I said, "So no. You'll pay it back. Every dollar with interest on a schedule Mr. Whitlock will send you Monday. It'll take you 15 years. And somewhere in about year 9, when you're still writing that check and you've stopped being angry about it, you're going to understand exactly what it cost a man to love you when he didn't have to. And maybe by then you'll be worth it." I stood up. I picked up the ledger. Whitlock gathered his papers. We walked out and left them there. Corinne was already on her phone. Priscilla was looking at the wall with an expression I can only describe as a woman revising a plan. Desmond was still crying. I did not look back, and I have thought about that decision every day since. And I am still not certain it was the right one, and I have decided to be at peace with not being certain. That was almost 2 years ago now. Here is what happened to them, and I am going to tell it flat, without any satisfaction in my voice, because I have discovered that there is none in it, and I was surprised by that. Corinne filed for bankruptcy 9 months later. The tax account came out in the discovery, the way those things do, and her firm found it, and she lost the certification she spent 20 years earning. She is 46 years old, and she is working as a bookkeeper for a landscaping outfit outside Charleston. She has not spoken to me. I did not expect her to. Priscilla left Desmond in the spring. It took her about 4 months from that conference room to work out that the list she had picked him off of had been misprinted, and she moved to a town outside Atlanta to live with a man whose name I have not troubled myself to learn. She did not fight for the boy. She sends things on his birthday. That is the detail about her that I find I cannot forgive, and I have tried. Desmond is making the payments. Late, grudging. Twice he has missed, and twice Whitlock has sent the letter, and twice the money has appeared inside the grace period. He has a kid to raise by himself now, and a house he cannot afford, and 14 more years of writing that check. In March, he called me. First time in 22 months. I let it go to voicemail because I am not a saint, and I wanted to know what he wanted before I heard his voice. He did not want anything. That was the thing. He called to tell me that his boy, who is 9, and whose name is Theodore, and whom I have not been allowed to see since that afternoon, had asked him at supper who Uncle Elias was because he'd found a photograph. And Desmond said he sat there and could not answer his own son. He said, "I didn't know him, Uncle Walter. I'm 43 years old, and that man paid for my whole life, and I could not tell my kid one true thing about him." I called him back the next day. We talked for 11 minutes. It was not a reconciliation. I want to be careful not to sell you one, because these stories always end with a reconciliation, and life mostly does not. But he is bringing Theodore up to the lake in August, just the two of them and me, for a weekend. Wren said it was fine, it is her cabin. She did not hesitate for even a second when I asked her, and she has more reason than anybody alive to hesitate. I do not know what will come of it, probably nothing, probably one awkward weekend and a boy who wants to go home. But my brother wrote not much of it, some in a ledger in 2014, about a man everybody else had written off. And I have decided that if Elias Cobb could extend somebody a 9-year line of credit on the strength of some, then I can manage one weekend. I drive down to Millbrook Falls on the second Tuesday of every month now. I sit in the same chair at the same diner where my brother sat, which they still have, in the corner by the window. I order the meatloaf because that is what he ordered. I leave a tip that embarrasses the girl who brings it, because Adeline Marsh worked those same floors for 19 years, for people who did not leave her one. Then I drive over to Wren's house, and I sit on her porch and I read a paperback while her son does his numbers at the kitchen table. And I have come to understand something about my brother that 32 years of Sunday phone calls never told me, which is that it is not a sacrifice. Sitting on that porch is not a thing a man endures. It is the best hour of my month, and it was the best hour of his, and he did it 400 times and never once mentioned it to me, because he thought I would take it away from him. The boy is 2 now, Elias Walter Calloway. He cannot say either of his names properly. He calls me Uncle Wa. He thinks I have always been here. Nobody has told him otherwise, and I do not intend to be the one who does. There will be a day, 20 years out, when he asks his mother why the old man in the pictures only shows up when the boy is already walking. And she will have to explain it, and she will explain it kindly because she is her mother's daughter. I will not be there for that conversation, and that is all right. It is the first thing in my life I have been genuinely glad to miss. I bought a ledger, green cloth, black spine, the closest thing I could find to my brother's, from a stationer in Asheville who had to order it and asked me twice if I was sure I didn't want something with a spreadsheet in it. The first entry is dated the second Tuesday of last September. Eli gave half his cracker to the dog without being asked. Nobody saw but me. That is what is in it. That is the whole book. Every second Tuesday I write down one decent thing that boy did while nobody was keeping score, and there is always one, and some months there are 6 and I have to choose. He will get it when he is old enough to understand what it is, which is not a record of what he owes. My brother kept a book of what people owed him, and it ran 19 years and $600,000, and it broke a family open when it finally saw daylight, and every entry in it was true, and I do not fault him for one line of it. He kept it because somebody had to keep the accounts, and nobody else was going to. But that was his book, and that was the world he was handed. I am keeping the other one. I have had almost 2 years to sit with all of this, mostly on a porch in a town my brother told me he hated. And I want to give you what I have got, because I am 71, and I did not come out of this with much that will survive me except the part I can say out loud. The first thing is this, and it is the one that cost me the most to learn. The money was never the story. $41 million is the least interesting fact in this entire account. And if that is the part you remember, then I have failed at telling it. And you should go back and listen for the folder on the kitchen table instead, because here is what that folder was. In 1979, my brother brought me the most fragile thing he owned, which was a plan for his own life, and I laughed at it. Not cruelly. That is what I need you to hear. I was not a villain in that kitchen. I was a tired man of 29 with a mortgage who thought he was being realistic on his brother's behalf. And I have since learned that most of the damage done in this world is done by people being realistic on somebody else's behalf. He never mentioned it again, and I took that silence as agreement, the way we do. There was no villain in that room, and it still cost him 30 years of hiding a life that was better than mine. So if you take one thing from an old man on a porch, take this. The people around you are handing you fragile things all the time. and they will almost never tell you that is what they are doing, and you will find out what you broke 30 years later or never. The second thing is about the arithmetic. Corinne took small amounts from a sick woman who loved her over 5 years, and she told herself it did not matter because nobody was adding it up. Desmond cut one corner in Colombia and told himself it did not matter because the witness took the money and went away. Priscilla picked a man off a list and told herself it did not matter because the photographs got buried. Every one of them was wrong, and not because there is a scoreboard in the sky. I do not know about that, and neither do you. They were wrong because it is not possible to do that kind of damage to other people and have it not come back to your own door, in this life, at this address. The numbers get added up, sometimes by a banker, sometimes by a green ledger in a steel drawer, sometimes just by time, which has been doing this work since long before any of us showed up and will keep doing it long after. And the third thing, which is the one I did not expect, and the one I am still working on. Decency is not the same as agreeableness. I was agreeable my whole life. 43 years at a desk, never made a scene, never raised my voice, sent the Christmas cards, showed up for the funerals. And my brother, who was quieter than me, who never argued with anybody about anything, was not agreeable at all. He was decent, which is a much harder and much lonelier thing. He respected a woman's terms for 18 years when every instinct he had said move in, marry her, fix it. He called a lawyer, instead of driving 4 hours to do the thing he wanted to do, to a man parked across a street. And I promise you that took more strength than the other thing would have. He kept a book on his own family for 19 years and never used it, because using it would have cost his brother a few Christmases. Every one of those choices cost him something. Every one of them was paid for out of his own loneliness. And that is the actual inheritance. Not the 41 million. The demonstration that a man can do the right thing 400 times in a row, with nobody clapping and no camera on him, and nothing at all coming back the other way, and that this is not weakness, and it is not naivete, and it is not being a doormat. It is the strongest thing I have ever seen a human being do, and I watched it from 90 miles away for 32 years, and I did not see it once. And so, to whoever is watching this who has been written off, by their children, by their in-laws, by the people who show up at the funeral to ask about the appraisal, let me tell you the only practical advice I have got. You do not have to shout. You do not have to threaten anybody. You do not have to spend the years you have left being bitter. And I want to say plainly that bitterness would have been the easy road for me, and it was available, and I nearly took it. Keep your spine, keep your records, keep your good name, because it is the only asset you have got that nobody can freeze or attach or appraise. And then let time do the work it has always been doing, whether or not anybody noticed. The people who underestimate you are telling on themselves. Every single time. The ones who treat you like you are already gone are almost always the ones who will be gone first, in every way that counts. And be careful, be so careful about who you decide is small. Because the quietest man at your table, the one who drives a 14-year-old truck and fills a bird feeder on Sunday mornings and never has much to add to the conversation, might be carrying the whole thing. He might have paid for your house. He might have paid for your children. He might be the only reason you still believe you come from decent people. You might bury him without ever knowing. I did. If this landed on you tonight, if there is somebody in your life you have been quietly writing off, or somebody who has been quietly carrying you, do me a favor. Subscribe to my channel and tell me their name down in the comments. Not the whole story, just the name. I read every one of them. And remember this. If you remember nothing else out of an old man's account of the worst and best year of his life, dignity is not what people give you. Dignity is what nobody can take. Every part of this I have written myself at my own kitchen table, on the same yellow legal pads I have been buying since the freight desk, and I have been slower about it than I meant to be. I am not a writer. I am a man who dispatched other people's cargo for 43 years, and is now trying at 71 to dispatch some of his own. I have changed the names. All of them, including my own. There are people in this story who are living quiet, good lives that they built out of wreckage, and they did not consent to being in an old man's account of anything. There are children in it who are 9 and 2, and who will one day be old enough to search their own names. And I am not going to be the reason they find this. Some details I have moved. Some I have compressed, because a life does not fit in an hour. And the honest shape of a thing is sometimes not the literal shape of it. But the folder was real. The laugh was real. The 90 miles were real. Every second Tuesday for 32 years. And so was the man who drove them. And so is the green ledger sitting on my kitchen table right now, with a boy's small decencies written in it, in an old dispatcher's handwriting. I have got no way to prove any of that to you, and I have decided I am at peace with that too. Thank you for sitting with me. I have got a drive to make in the morning.